And we're live. It is Thursday, the 8th of July, the year of our Lord 2005. The UN General Assembly has left us in the lurch again. It is not the International Day of anything and will not be until the 11th. I don't know what the General Assembly does all day. You'd think that once a day they could, vote to declare the day a day of something. Just give me something to talk about. I enjoyed yesterday, International Kiswahili Day, very much. But today I'm left with an empty feeling, as though something's missing from my life. And something's missing from all of your lives. It is a formal declaration by the people of the world that today is honoring something chosen almost at random. Sometimes a value, sometimes a group of people, sometimes a physical object of some sort or a technology, sometimes a cultural heritage, and done almost without regard for the empty space that it is creating. For example, when you declare July 8th International Kiswahili Day, you are also declaring it not International Zosha Day. You are also declaring it not International Arabic Day. And, that raises inclusiveness issues. There are other days in the year, of course, and we could fill in all those voids by the UN General Assembly doing its job a little bit more consistently. And yet, that didn't happen. So, that notwithstanding, there is another void in our hearts today. And that is the absence of co-hosts, because Holly is out cavorting with beasts, watching the great beast migration. Nastya is writing about the Arctic. Ev is doing whatever it is Ev does, building a house, doing AI policy and law stuff. GDF has a couple kids. Minna is, off being busy. And so I am on my own. Alicia was on yesterday. And so I am on my own today, folks. And without the support of the UN General Assembly to give me copy to talk about, without any co-hosts, Scott Shapiro is being a tech entrepreneur, it's just one of those days. And yet I look outside. The sun is shining. The birds are chirping. It's a soupy Washington day, and it's going to be a great one because you are watching Dog Shirt TV, and it is a goddamn revolution. It's also a resolution, but it's a damn revolution of morning television, in morning television. And one of the revolutionary features of the show, and there are many of them, is that some days it is just me and you. And, maybe somebody will pop in. Maybe somebody will not. But it's just us. And we got to assume that. And that means that you all have to be, that's right, Carol T. Maybe John Roush will step up. I even sent him a note this morning that said he should. But, Jonathan Roush also sleeps and is often not awake at this hour. And so, the likelihood that it is just going to be us, and we're going to be talking about whatever on your mind is high. We are not allowed to have fun anymore, but we can do a reasonable facsimile of fun. Um, and let's start with Japanese history. Carol
Yes,
G.
I I was I could use a break from the news,
I could too.
and I wondered if you would like to explain to me, having shot you down so summarily, if you would explain why you felt that Tokugawa was the first totalitarian state.
Well, I was sort of joking, but only sort of. I mean, so the first of all, the shogunate was premised on a kind of proto North Korean like isolation where um the borders of the country were not quite impregnable, but certainly impregnable to Europeans, save for the Dutch at a single port. And this was an effort to prevent colonization, but it was also an effort to prevent Western influences of any kind. And it was weirdly successful for, 200 plus years until it fell apart. Um, but the second component of it was that the internal controls on culture were something fierce, and I think something that no other country had really ever attempted before. There were, you know, very strict regulations about what kind of art could be produced, and there was and I think if you look around at 18th and 19th century authoritarianisms, they were kind of less ambitious than the shogunate was about what you could control. And of course, they enforced this um, very backward looking um, uh, caste system that was, sort of highly inflected by Budo, the sort of samurai warrior ethic. And they were a, um, they were in a way that I don't think I can think of a analog to before, at least before kind of late czarist um, you know, authoritarianism. They were remarkably interested in controlling people's thought. And so I guess that's what I was referring to. I didn't mean it in the sense of um uh the the authoritarian the totalitarianism of the 20th century, but I sitting here now, I can't think of an example of a more internally authoritarian society than Tokugawa Japan in the 17th century or 18th century.
I'm curious what you mean about controlling thought.
Well, there was a very limited range of, I mean, artistic production was just, essentially you couldn't you couldn't make prints outside of a very limited range of a sort of approved painting styles, pottery styles, print styles. There were um you couldn't they brutally repressed any signs of Christianity or
Well, Christianity, when you say Western values, I would argue that it is Christianity in particular that they were concerned about, and that is linked with concerns about colonization because they knew what had gone on in, say, Mexico. And the fear about Christianity was that it basically would create a fifth column. And if a Christian country invaded, whose side would any Christians be on? Would they go with their co-religionists or would they go with the Japanese?
So I'm not saying, in some respects, the
Because in
goal,
intellectual circles, I mean, the Dutch books that were scientific were very much sought after.
right. The question is, if you brought in um anything else, that wasn't technology, that could you bring it in? And I think the answer is no, right? Like, you couldn't bring in the Scots Enlightenment books. You couldn't bring in, you know, and they were interested in technology. They were interested in, you
Well,
know,
they
f-
were interested in things that didn't have anything to do with religion.
but what about politics? What about um, the um, the trade in non-religious ideas? If you wanted to bring in John Locke, what happens?
Well, particularly as you get later, yes, the Neo-Confucian ideology becomes very, very strong. Um, as far as the caste system and looking backwards, I really think that was much looser before the Tokugawa period. It really was at the end of the 16th century that they became fixed so that you technically couldn't move from one to the other, although people did. There was movement, particularly among the wealthier peasantry and the lower samurai and the artisans.
Interesting.
And that was, and part of the reason that I reacted so strongly was because, for one thing, a lot of the sumptuary laws, there were lots of those in Europe in the Middle Ages, right? Of certain kinds of displays of wealth only being open to certain levels of society.
Sure.
Um,
Although
and
not in the 19th century.
no, 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 not in the 19th
Right. I
century.
mean, one of the things about Tokugawa Japan that's very striking is that the most rigid forms of feudalism survive until 1868, which, I look, who were we to talk? We had the most rigid form of feudalism. So I'm not saying it as a, but I do think that, compared to, when Japan skipped everything between the Middle Ages and modernity, right? It kind of has this, it's right in the middle of medieval feudalism when all of a sudden the world changes and it builds, an incredible modern army and an incredible navy, and, it industrializes, I think, faster than any country has ever industrialized. It's, but it's, in a period of a remarkably small number of years, it goes from, I don't know, 95% rural to 95% urban. It's a kind of, I think it's I think it's a, genuinely unusual case. Tell me about how did you get into this period of Japanese history? Tell us a little bit about your uh, engagement in this subject. Because
Well,
I feel stupid arguing with you about it, because one of us actually knows something about the subject and the
no, I
other,
was I was curious, and it's certainly not indefensible, right? A lot of my attention is directed towards the success of a lot of this, which was limited. And the Tokugawa had limited control over much of the country, right? They certainly because of their military power, which is what it was originally based on, right? They had defeated everybody else. Um, other places were happy to model their laws on those of the Tokugawa Shogunate, but there was no direct ability of the shogunate to tax people in other domains, to make laws for people in other domains. Um, there were a lot of controls that were very strict. Trade was restricted. There was a restriction. You weren't supposed to do traveling just for traveling's sake, right? You needed passes to go
Right.
from one town to another. Yet pilgrimages were exempt. And so pilgrimages became very popular because they were free forms of sightseeing.
That's interesting.
All you had to do was say, "Oh well, I'm going to the Great Shrine at Ise," and you were golden.
And was that used as a way of uh, circumventing the restrictions on a regular basis, or was that
Yes,
unusual?
not at all. And there were a lot. I mean, this is why. I mean, my first reaction was, well, enforcement is the problem, and that was a big problem because a lot of these things turn out to have been aspirational more than you controllable, right? Um, a lot of the real creativity did take place in the places that were regular, relatively free of any kind of deliberately relatively free. For example, Yoshiwara, the pleasure quarters. And a lot of the real vitality of the culture occurred on the very much lower levels of society. And they kind of allowed a lot of that. Um, the woodblock prints that are so famous, those were essentially postcards,
Right.
right?
Well, and a huge number of them are preserved because they were used as packing material after the Meiji Restoration. They were so valueless that people used them um, to pack up, tchotchkes, which were essentially imitation Chinese porcelain, and ship them to London and to other European ports. And I forget the guy's name. He was a curator at the British
Oh,
Museum or
was it? Oh no, the MFA, I thought.
yeah, but
Uh,
somebody
Boston.
figured out that you could go down to the docks and
Oh,
just
okay.
take the packing material, and that these are now famous woodblock prints. But you just had to uncrinkle and iron them. Um, so, who knew? Um,
And those were, obviously they weren't suppressed, but they weren't valued,
right.
right? The really valuable art was very specifically um, restricted, I guess.
Guided.
There you go. Good word.
Yeah, I mean, all authoritarianisms have weird exceptions and create weird outlets. Famously, Russian, the Tsarist period and the Soviet period both give rise to obscure satires that you have to know how to decode. Um, and, um, a lot of that stuff doesn't survive subsequent eras because we don't you have to be a scholar of the period to actually decode it. And you know um but I guess my your point is very well taken, that it is easy to take the restrictions at face value and say this is an unusually repressive society. I guess I and that focusing on the exceptions and the permissions is a fruitful way of figuring out what people were really thinking about. I guess I
I
still
guess you're
don't.
seeing so many there were so many evasions, right? I mean, samurai weren't supposed to go into Yoshiwara, but they did all the time. They would do things to disguise their hairstyle so it wasn't in your face. But that was, and that was tolerated. A lot of it was appearance was what mattered far more than substance.
But why should I think of that um, as when if we put it in the Soviet Union in the Stalin era, arguably one of the two or three most repressive regimes in the world, and we focus on all the exceptions in which people were actually able to do things without getting killed, um, you wouldn't say that Stalin was less repressive as a result of that. You would say that, gosh, the human spirit is remarkable and people had incredible urge to express things even so. Um, and things happen despite the repression. Why should we treat the Tokugawa period any differently?
I see the exceptions as the rule.
In other words, that the
I'm
regime
not,
was
I'm not,
sufficiently Swiss cheese, that the holes are really part of the regime in the way that that's not just sort of not true
right.
of
I
Stalin.
don't see them as being exceptions.
And do
I
you,
mean, in some ways, they're part of the system. And again, what matters is, again, there were differences according to, where you were. But this was one of the reasons that I brought up Musui's story, because it's not that he was usual, but this was a man who was, um, okay, he was a younger son in a family. There was another family which had no children, which needed an heir to their house, and you were not allowed to adopt people who were, men who were under, I think it was 14. I'm not sure. Musui went through the formality when he was 7, and the Tokugawa official doing it said, "Why, you look young for your age." And that was fine. Nobody
that's
cared.
what people said to me when I was 7 too, and everybody was pretending that I was 35.
Right? Exactly. And this was normal. Okay, this happened all the time. What happened that was unusual about him was in some ways, he was a throwback to an older type of samurai value, right? He liked to get into fights. He liked to see himself as generous, so that he had um, some of his income was derived ostensibly from villages where he would go and deliberately um, be lenient on taxation, and he he stole money from the shogunate. The worst thing that happened to him was his brother was told to essentially build a cage in the backyard as his prison, for his punishment. And that sounds bad enough, except that during the period of time that he was there, um, his first child was born. So clearly, his wife was visiting him in this supposed cage. There are any num and this there are any number of things in his life where he was breaking the rules left and right, with impunity. Now, this is truly an exception, right? He was not the rule, except in things like being able to succeed the house. But the fact that he was very notorious, his older brother was a very solid shogunal official. And it's hard for me to think in Stalin's world that that would not have had consequences on his family if the brother was a fairly responsible, fairly high-ranking official, and he had a younger brother who was doing all these horrible things.
Yeah, well, he wouldn't have, and the younger brother wouldn't have just had a cage in his backyard.
Right.
Uh, so do you attribute, if we say I was wrong to the extent I used the word totalitarian, and the right word is, uh, you know, quite authoritarian, but with big structural exceptions.
Yeah, I like that.
Um, can you think of a regime before the 20th century that is more authoritarian, um, in its the scope and scale of what it seeks to regulate?
To be honest, I'm not that well versed in a lot of other history. Okay. One of the things that happens when you take up a topic like this is all of your time and attention is eaten up by
Right.
your own field. And I certainly have a much broader knowledge of history than your average American, most history. But it's, I don't know enough specifics about regimes. I think part of it depends on what level you're looking at. Again, if you look at, I went on a campus interview for the Naval Academy in Annapolis. I didn't get the job, that's okay. But I taught a class, and I was supposed to teach a class on early modern Western Civ or something like that. And on our honeymoon, my husband looked out over Versailles, and he said, "What would what would the emperor have said to Louis the XIV?" And I said, he would have said, "You can do what?"
That's
Because the emperor, of
interesting.
course, was not, I said, "Your real question is the shogun." So what I did for this class was I contrasted
And
the
just for those who don't uh, understand that, the emperor has not ruled in Japan in a meaningful way since a very long time ago. When the last truly ruling emperor was is a matter of some discussion, but it's sort of lost in,
the 8th, ninth century.
yeah, really, really long time ago. And the shogun, starting in most of Japanese history, is explained in terms of local warlordisms, not, masking, an imperial. Everybody acknowledges the emperor, but in fact, the emperor doesn't command anything. It is not until the Tokugawa period where there is a single kind of unified warlordism, or relatively unified
Relatively
warlordism,
unified.
under an official called the shogun, who is basically operating, as sort of a chief executive officer for the emperor, but also sort of the emperor's imprisoner, um, who in fact runs Japan. And that is and that ends in 1868, when the Americans show up with a supposed restoration of the emperor, which is called the Meiji Restoration, which in fact was not a restoration of imperial power at all. It was the replacement of the shogunate with a very complicated combination of military and parliamentary and uh, kind of uh, uh, it becomes a very complicated government that becomes increasingly dominated by the military until the end of World War II. So when Carol says what the emperor would have said if he saw um, Versailles, um, and then sort of corrects herself and says, "No, the shogun." That's a reflection of the sort of duality of Japanese power that
Well, I
you
was
have.
correcting my husband. I said the emperor would have said, you can do
I
that.
see.
I mean, because the emperor got to set the calendar and that's about it.
Right, and got to, and really did not do public appearances. I mean, he was understood to be a god, but not actually in the sense of doing anything. It's a,
It was basically the source of legitimacy. That, and I think, and that is, yeah, and that is his longest lasting function.
and
And
still
that's why,
is the only, and when the Japanese surrendered unconditionally in 1945, there was actually a condition that the Americans accepted, which is that the emperor would not be removed from power.
no,
No,
I'm sorry, that's incorrect. That's what they wanted, and the Americans would not accept it. Nevertheless,
but they left the emperor in place.
they had already decided by as early as 1943, 42, that they would leave the emperor in place.
Because he was such a good botanist.
Well, he was a good source of social control. Everybody in Japan and in America were worried that if you took out that structure, Japan would fall into disorder and communism potentially.
So we didn't, so correct me here. We didn't agree to not remove the emperor. We refused to agree to it. We just didn't do it.
Exactly.
See, this is the kind of
And
diplomacy.
that was the real sticking point in the surrender.
That's interesting. I thought it was kind of an agreement rather than an understanding.
If there had been an agreement, you would not have had those last ditch efforts by the lower military to stop it, right?
Interesting.
The whole idea was that they were afraid that the emperor would be hanged, would be held responsible and hanged.
So I'm going to
And
pause here and just point out that there are many morning shows that y'all can watch, but this
we're
is
going
the
to be
only
talking.
one. And I just want to lay this out here because, I love you, Joe and Mika, but you're not doing this. There's no other show that you can watch that at 8 o'clock a.m. you have no idea what we're talking about. And I don't have any idea what we're talking about. And I'm bewailing the fact that my co-hosts have, abandoned me today. And I didn't bother to get a guest because I was busy yesterday getting a lawyer. And, you can, you have, your troubles. But by 8:33, a member of the audience has stepped up to give a master class on 20th and 19th and 18th century Japanese history. Um, and by the way, nobody planned this. And so I just want to say, like, there are 30 of you in the audience right now, and each of you has something to talk about. And so I, just want to let Carol T, whom we call Carol on this show, be a lesson to you all. Step up and share the things you know, because, it's just like a revolution in morning television. And, I would love to tell you that I planned that we were doing a show on Japanese history today, but I didn't. And if I did, it would be less interesting than this because it wouldn't have that element of surprise where you came in saying, what are they going to talk about today? And when Carol showed up on the screen, you would have said, oh, they've planned a show on Japanese history. It wouldn't have had that that element of what's she going to talk about? What's going on here? But now we build in the suspense, and we don't know who the next person is going to show up on screen. Is it going to be Richard Wattenbarger talking about 19th century music history? I just want to say, if it is, he's going to have to defend his affinity for Anton Bruckner. Like, I'm just
I'm
here.
stunned that nobody's already come in and taken
Change
over.
the subject?
Yeah.
No, because they're all spellbound, and I am just a guy sitting on the surfboard, bobbing on the waves here. Anyway, back to you, Carol. Um, uh, all right, here's my other question about the Tokugawa dynasty, which I have never understood, and I'm sure there is a good answer to, but I've just never uh, looked into it, which is, why did it collapse so suddenly? Matthew Perry shows up in Edo Harbor, now Tokyo Harbor, with a few ships. They're gunboats, but, whatevs. The Japanese were not unfamiliar with Western ships. And this whole regime that had been so successful in keeping out Western influences of a non-scientific variety had a kind of, mystical control over the borders, had, restricted Western trade to the Dutch at Doshisha. All of it collapses all of a sudden. And I've never, that's taught as a fact. But there's no discussion that, at least in the classes that I took or the readings that I did, of why the society was that, or the rulership cadre of the society was that brittle, that a few gunboats in Edo could, magically dissolve the society, and create this, revolutionary moment.
It's a very interesting question. And part of it is because there were already tensions within the shogunate, broadly speaking. And right, 1600, when the Tokugawa army defeated everybody else, is when they really established their dominance, and they maintained it fairly strongly the first century or so. They claimed the right to move people around in their domains, take them away, move them. And they did that quite a lot. But then after that, it went into abeyance. And their bigger demonstrations of power had also fallen off. It seemed unnecessary. The sakoku, the policy of the closed country, was not actually solidified and established until 1638. So it was not really one of the defining features, the fundamental features of it, but it became so closely entwined with the Tokugawa power that when it was threatened, that undermined a main pillar of legitimacy for the shogunate. And there were people who were looking to use that in order to increase their own power. And what happened was it had become so closely associated with the shogunate and with the emperor as the fundamental source of legitimacy, right? That the opponents of the Baku, of the shogunate, were able to say, you are not serving the emperor. You are bad people, you are bad ministers, and you have lost the legitimacy because you're not doing what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to, represent the emperor. And one of the reasons that it fell apart quickly was the Tokugawa, in trying to decide what to do with the foreign, with dealing with the Americans and other nations that were eager to get in, to access Japan's markets, basically. Um, it was uh, it was such a momentous decision that they convened a council of the daimyo to say of the rural, not rural, the men who were in charge of the other parts of Japan, right? Um,
The districts,
the districts
kind
that,
of equivalent to a Russian oblast or a French département.
but largely autonomous. And was a bad idea because what happened was they were opposed. And so there was this backdrop. And one of the things that has always fascinated me
And
was,
just to be before we get to the thing that's fascinated you, over what time frame does this take place? Because when you read about it in history books, it's kind of like, oh, Commodore Perry shows up and the shock destroys the system.
yeah,
Is this
it
a
took
matter
longer
of
term
days,
than that.
weeks, months?
We're talking, Perry showed up in 1853. The shogunate falls apart in 1868. Okay, the biggest changes are the first 5 years before the Harris Treaty, before the first treaty establishing some access to the Americans in Japan. And in that already it wasn't a complete capitulation because they did agree to build a port outside of Kyushu, outside of Nagasaki, near Tokyo, but not to give them access to Tokyo port, right? Um, but it did start. It was the first of the treaties um, that established things like extraterritoriality, right? That the Japanese laws did not apply to the foreigners in their midst, that punitive tariffs, things like that. One of the things that is interesting is that the opposition to the shogunate was the slogan was revere the emperor, expel the
Expel the
barbarian,
barbarians.
right?
Son no
From
Joey.
no Joey, right? And once they actually overthrew the shogunate, they worked like crazy to copy the foreigners in order to modernize, update what they had, because in 1600 the technology, the warfare, all of that stuff in Japan was roughly equivalent. But by the mid 19th century, they had fallen so far behind.
Right. They had muskets and did not
They had cannon, yes, and
cannon,
muskets.
yeah. They don't, there's something, um, cannon and sword is not a 19th century, a late 19th century fighting force. Um, so, all right. That's interesting. I mean, we think of it as something that happened over a very short period of time, but what you're talking about is really about 15 years.
Yeah, not overnight.
Interesting.
And even some of the changes took longer, right? One of the things that they did was they abolished the caste system, right? There was no more, the samurai were no longer at the top. The system, for people who don't know, was the samurai were at the top because they were the ruling class, and the next level down was the peasants because they produced the goods, and the next level down was the artisans because they transformed the goods into useful products. And at the bottom were the richest people in society, the merchants, because all they made was money.
And then there was a fifth
And then there's
category,
the
which
fifth category,
which still
which still
exists,
exists.
which is the so-called untouchables,
Yes.
who handled
In
dead
today's
bodies.
language, the people who are discriminated against.
Yeah.
Hisabetsui. Okay.
Um, and it's still
Which is
an
much better than calling them filth.
yeah, still an underclass, and still and everybody denounces the system and also won't ever let their children marry one. It's a remarkable internal discrimination within a race that is a kind of interesting um, uh, interesting social phenomenon.
One of the more interesting things about that, I just want to put in quickly, was they have existed for, ever since the beginning, but castes were fluid before the end of the 16th century. And it was really once Hideyoshi, one of the predecessors of the Tokugawa, froze the social classes and said, you cannot move between classes, which, as we said, is only so much. It was only then that it became a permanent stigma.
Interesting. So since you've become the guest of this show over the course of, I suppose we should know a little bit about who you are. What is T for? What's your actual full name?
Carol Tsang, Tsang. My husband is Chinese American, born here.
And your,
My middle name, I took my birth name, which is Richmond.
and I take it you were pre-retirement a historian of a Japanese historian. What, like, tell us a little bit about your career in history. Where were
More
you
strictly
based?
speaking, before my unemployment, I was a professor of Japanese history. Okay, I I had a circuitous route to my education. I started college at 30 and did very, very well. I don't want to go into too much detail on that. And while I was an undergraduate, I became fascinated by Japanese history. And so I pursued that, and I did well enough that I got into a very good graduate school, and became a historian. So after that, I did get a job at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and I taught there for about 6 or 7 years. Anybody who's in academia knows, aha, she didn't get tenure. And that's exactly what happened. Um, and I did start to look for other work, hence my interview at the Naval Academy. Um, but my husband suddenly decided that he didn't want to live outside a major metropolitan area. And that that effectively presented me with the choice between pursuing a career or remaining married. And I reverted to my 1950s, early 60s upbringing roots and decided that my marriage was more important.
And how long ago was that?
22 years ago,
And so where are you guys based now?
Boston. We had been, okay, I was in Chicago. My husband worked for IBM in New York State. He's a research physicist, and he was at their flagship lab. And so I was commuting for the years that I was at UIC, but then I moved back to Westchester, which was unfortunate because that's where I grew up and I'd been dying to get out. But anyway, moving right along. Um, and so we lived there for quite a while, and then he retired. And when he came back and told me that he had been, that he had accepted the retirement and he was done, I said, "Great, are we moving to Boston or Washington?"
And you chose Boston.
Oh, no, we chose Washington.
Ah,
Actually, because at the time we were very active outdoors, much longer outdoor recreational time in Boston, much longer season, and in Washington. So we lived in Washington for about 15 years and really enjoyed it, especially before the pandemic, especially before Trump, but really, really liked it. And that's how I became aware of you in lawfare, because my husband started to going to all of these think tank talks, and I tagged along to several Brookings Institution talks. And
interesting.
okay, um, but with the 2020 election coming up, and a lot of your audience does not have much experience of Washington, I imagine, but Washington, the local industry is politics.
Yeah, you're
Every,
saturated in it in a
everybody's a
way that,
pundit. This,
I have a
the
joke.
cashier, the cab driver, we're all pundits, right?
I have a joke with that, when I go to other places and I see people who I know from Washington, the joke is, what do people actually talk about here? And you can't tell that joke to people who aren't from Washington because they don't understand it. That in DC, kind of like in LA, that the DC joke is that DC is LA for ugly people. And but it has a very similar culture that everybody's only ever talking about the business, and it's a real star fucking culture in terms of seeing people, people spotting, and the atmosphere here is really, really different in times of political upheaval than it is anywhere else.
And I really, really enjoyed that for about 10 years. And then a little bit less so, but a lot. But with the 2020 election coming up, it was so there was so much anxiety for me involved in all of the political talk that I began to feel like I couldn't breathe. And I was afraid of what would happen if he lost, but I was more afraid of what would happen if he won, and I was not at all sure that he wouldn't. My sister, who lives in Australia, had made me promise to be out of town for the 2020 election, and she would have been much happier if I moved. And I decided that was not a bad idea. And that was when we decided to go to our other retirement place where we had always thought we would end up, which is Boston.
And have you stayed involved with matters Japanese history in the 20 plus years
Not
since you
much.
left?
Not much. Um, it's bittersweet.
Hmm. And have,
Um,
sorry, go ahead.
Partly because all of the people that I knew as graduate student and everything, they've become very much more successful. And why I didn't has to do with my personality. I'm not a very confident person, and I don't value my work very much. And of course, that is fatal in academia. If I had thought about it, I would never have chosen that for a career.
That's
Oh, you
interesting.
asked me how I got into Japanese history.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the standard answer really is temporary insanity plus intellectual masochism. I like beating my head against a wall. Okay. Um, but the fact is, it was 1985. I knew nothing about Japan. I knew that Perry had opened it in 1853, but I really had no idea what that meant. And so I had always liked history. I was already gravitating to it. And I thought, how am I going to learn about this? I will take a history course. And it was love at first sight.
It is endlessly fascinating in a way that I suppose all countries are if you dive into their history seriously, but there's something about the vacillations between extreme isolation and extreme engagement with the rest of the world that lead to these incredible results that are, everything from the Tokugawa period to, the war in the Pacific to the Sony Corporation, right? And the Ginza that is really hard to uh, it it's a uh, it's one of the most profoundly ethnically homogenous countries of its size. I mean, I suppose, I mean, China's ethnic homogeneity is fake. Japan's is real. Uh,
We had it
Realish.
quite a while back, right? Finland is Norway is homogeneous. Well, it is, but it kind of depends on where you're looking from.
Yeah, I mean, look,
But I agree with
I
you.
don't mean
I'm
it,
just,
I don't mean it's as ethnically homogenous as people say glibly. I do think it's 130 million people, and it's remarkably ethnically
yes.
homogeneous for any population size of n equals 130 million. It's, for example, it's roughly the same population size as Russia, and Russia is, a third, 40% Muslim. An
Right.
enormous number of the people are actually, uh, Central Asian, Caucasus. Um, I'm trying to think of 130 million people in the world who are remotely as ethnically homogenous as certainly not the you can't get there in any other country I can think of, um, and yet it is an ethnic homogeneity that has these profound cultural impacts on the rest of the world, um, both through at times conquest, for through commercial impacts of cultural products and technological products. It's a very unusual society. Hello, Richard.
Good
I was
morning.
making fun
Good
of your
morning,
affinity
Carol.
Good
I was
morning.
making fun of your affinity for Bruckner earlier
I,
and
I,
felt sure you
I
would show up to defend yourself, and then
well,
you didn't, because I assumed you weren't on the show.
no,
But
I
here you
just,
are.
um,
Oh, just real quick, Andrew wanted to know if I speak and read Japanese, and the answer is absolutely. It's really hard to do research if you don't. That's it. Sorry, Richard.
well,
Richard, the last 4 minutes of the show are yours.
yeah, I have this little bit of show and tell. Miriam, my wife, was cleaning out some files late yesterday, and she found this artifact from days of yore, which I thought I would share. And this is what it is, uh, and this is from November 1996, and I find it endlessly amusing. Um, so I don't know. Can you see it? Read
So
it?
I cannot see it, but judging from the
Oh,
fact that it is First Things and it is from that period, I assume it is because I have an article in it.
no, no, no. It's an issue from, so it's November 1996, and the issue in big. I'm surprised. Is it showing up now?
It's just very blurry for me. It
Oh,
may
okay.
be because of your
So
bandwidth or it may be
uh,
because of mine, but I can't see it. So just
okay. Well, I'll
read
give you the
us the
description.
headline that's interesting you.
Yes, this is the end of democracy. They had a symposium, and it's the subtitle, if I can read it backwards. Wait a minute. The judicial usurpation of politics, and with contributions from such luminaries as Robert Bork, Robbie George, and others whom you can, if it's not blurry, you can see. And I found it so amusing uh, that this was the panic on the right 30 years ago, and how things change.
So it was on, so just a bit of cultural history, political history. That was the panic on the right for a very long time.
Right? Yeah.
And I mean, it is the essential critique um, of the court from Bork and Scalia, um, the latter of whom made it at great length, or sorry, at brief length, in a short, very powerful book called A Matter of Interpretation, the latter of whom made it at greater length, Bork made it at greater length in his famous post nomination book, The Tempting of America, which has terrible parts and wonderful parts. But yeah, the belief that we were slipping into a kind of rule by nine Platonic guardians was, and that they would always side with the cultural left, on the biggest questions of the day was a driver of modern conservatism for a generation, um, uh, and there are many, many, many such magazine covers and symposia, um, involving those same luminaries and others. Richard Wattenbarger, thank you for sharing that with us. You're a great American, and a giant thanks to Carol Tsang for telling me her last name, so that I can thank her properly, and for a remarkable impromptu lesson on pre-war, pre-restoration, Meiji Restoration, Japanese politics and culture. This was a total surprise, and I want you all to reflect on it, to think about what your role in the greater Dogshirt TV ecosystem, cinematic universe is. We're going to be back tomorrow. I don't know if there'll be a co-host. I don't know if there'll be a guest. But I know that, as Carol did today, one of you will stand up and be outstanding. See you later.